Winter 1941. Deep within the Imperial war rooms of Tokyo, Japan's most powerful military commanders gathered around polished wooden tables. Maps sprawled before them. Victories seemed inevitable. Their forces had swept through the Pacific with devastating efficiency. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. Southeast Asia trembled. The Philippines would soon fall. But one man stood alone with a truth that would shatter their confidence completely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had just returned from briefing the high command. His face carried the weight of terrible knowledge. While his fellow officers celebrated their victories and planned the next phase of conquest, Yamamoto had been studying something else entirely. Something that made his blood run cold. Something that would determine whether Japan lived or died. The question hanging over that war room was simple, yet monumental. Could Japan invade the American mainland? The generals believed they could. They had conquered nation after nation with superior tactics and unbreakable warrior spirit. But Yamamoto had walked the streets of America. He had lived among its people for years as a naval attaché. He had seen things that intelligence reports could never capture, and what he discovered would prove more terrifying than any army the world had ever assembled. Yamamoto wasn't like the other commanders. While they saw America through military assessments and strategic calculations, he had witnessed the nation's true character firsthand. During his years stationed in Washington and traveling across the United States, he had observed something that haunted him ever since. He remembered small farming towns in the American heartland, bustling cities along both coasts. From the mountains of Colorado to the plains of Kansas, he noticed a pattern that repeated itself with unsettling consistency. American homes were fundamentally different from Japanese homes, not in architecture or size, but in what they contained, in what they revealed about the people who lived inside them. In Japan, military strength belonged to the military. Weapons were the domain of soldiers, carefully controlled and centralized. The civilian population lived separate from martial power. But America operated on an entirely different principle, one that Yamamoto found both fascinating and deeply troubling. Gun shops. Not just in major cities, but in every town. Hardware stores with rifles displayed in windows. Sporting goods establishments where families browsed ammunition alongside fishing equipment. Shooting ranges where fathers taught young children to aim and fire. Hunting clubs with thousands of members. This wasn't a military society. Yet somehow it was the most heavily armed civilian population on Earth. The generals gathered that winter day had tasted victory after victory. Their confidence bordered on arrogance. China had fallen. European colonies throughout Asia crumbled. The British, French, and Dutch scattered like leaves in a storm. The Americans had been humiliated at Pearl Harbor. When Yamamoto stood before them with great expression and detailed reports, they expected confirmation of what they already believed. That America would sue for peace soon, that the war was essentially won. Instead, Yamamoto presented intelligence that changed everything. His reports contained surveys of American gun ownership, photographs of civilian shooting competitions, data on ammunition sales, and assessments of marksmanship culture. Each piece of intelligence painted the same disturbing picture. In Japan, Yamamoto began, if you want someone who knows how to shoot accurately, you go to a military base. Perhaps one civilian in 1,000 has real marksmanship skill. He paused before delivering the devastating truth. In America, walk into any small town, any farming community, any suburban neighborhood, you'll find dozens of people who've been shooting since childhood. They grow up hunting. They practice for sport. They compete in marksmanship contests. Many can hit moving targets at distances that would challenge our best snipers. The generals shifted in their seats. Yamamoto continued, his voice heavy with implication. Intelligence estimates roughly 100 million firearms in civilian hands throughout America. Nearly one gun for every person in their entire population. The number hung in the air like poison gas. 100 million weapons. Not in armories. Not in military depots. In homes. In closets. Under beds. Mounted on walls. Passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Now consider the training, Yamamoto pressed on. These aren't conscripts with a few weeks of basic instruction. These are people who learned to shoot as children, who spent their lives practicing, who hunt through difficult terrain in all weather, who can track, aim, and fire with precision that comes from decades of experience. He pulled out regional analyses showing gun ownership across different states. The numbers varied, but the overall picture remained terrifyingly consistent. In rural areas, nearly every household has multiple firearms. In suburban regions, the majority own at least one. Even in cities, millions are armed. And their cultural attitude. He searched for words. They don't see firearms as tools of war. They see them as fundamental rights, as symbols of independence, as protection for their families. A general interrupted. Surely their government would confiscate these weapons in wartime? Centralize arms distribution like any rational military power? Yamamoto actually laughed, bitter and humorless. You don't understand Americans. Their nation was born from revolution. Farmers and shopkeepers who fought the British Empire and won. They celebrate this. They teach it to their children. Their founding document specifically protects citizens' right to bear arms. Any government attempt to confiscate civilian weapons would trigger civil war. Americans would sooner fight their own government than surrender their firearms. Stunned silence filled the room. They were beginning to grasp the implications. Yamamoto unrolled a large map of the United States across the table. The sheer size dwarfed maps of Japan. The scales seemed incomprehensible. Let's discuss invasion logistics, he said, shifting into clinical analysis. Suppose we achieve the impossible, land 1 million troops on the West Coast, establish a beachhead, push inland. His finger traced from California toward the interior. We must cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, then the Mojave Desert, then the Rocky Mountains, ranges that make our peaks look like hills. Each barrier would slow our advance, require enormous supply lines, give the Americans time to mobilize. The generals leaned closer, studying terrain features. But geography is only the beginning, Yamamoto continued. Let's talk about what waits in every town, every village, every farmhouse along the way. He pulled out demographic breakdowns by region. America has roughly 130 million people. Conservatively, assume half are fighting age and capable. 65 million potential combatants. Assume only 1 in 10 is armed and willing to fight. That's still 6.5 million armed civilians. A general protested. Civilians are not soldiers. They lack discipline, organization, command structure. True, Yamamoto interrupted. They lack formal military structure, but they possess something far more dangerous for invaders: intimate knowledge of their land. Every road, every forest path, every hiding place. They're defending their homes, their families, their soil. History shows such defenders fight with desperation and effectiveness that no military training can match. He let that settle. And these aren't peasants with pitchforks. Every defender would be armed with rifles comparable to our military weapons. Many would have hunting rifles with greater range and accuracy than standard issue. They'd have ammunition stockpiled. They'd know how to maintain weapons, shoot accurately under pressure. Yamamoto's voice grew quieter, more intense. Picture this. Our forces approach a small farming town. Population 5,000. Nothing strategic, just an ordinary American community. We need to secure it for supply lines. As we enter, we take fire, not from a garrison, but from civilians. Shopkeepers shooting from second-story windows. Farmers firing from behind equipment. Teenagers with their fathers' rifles on rooftops. How do we respond? We can't bomb the town. We need the roads, the infrastructure, the supplies. So we clear it building by building, room by room. His finger tapped the map emphatically. Now multiply that by 10,000 towns, 100,000 farms, millions of homes, every single one potentially hostile. Every approach a potential ambush. Every mile paid for in blood. The implications crashed over the officers like a tsunami. This wasn't army against army, fleet against fleet. This was something altogether different and infinitely more dangerous. Another general spoke, asking about a limited invasion. What if we don't conquer the entire nation? Simply secure California? Hold the West Coast as negotiating leverage? Yamamoto had anticipated this. He pulled out naval charts showing the Pacific. Tokyo to San Francisco, 5,000 miles. Every bullet, every grain of rice, every replacement soldier crosses that distance. American submarines are already hunting our cargo vessels. Their navy is crippled but not destroyed. Their submarine capabilities remain significant. He drew a line across the Pacific. This supply line becomes the most vulnerable strategic weakness in military history. The Americans only need to disrupt it, not break it completely. Every convoy becomes a target. Meanwhile, they fight on their own continent. Their supplies travel by train and truck over roads they control. Their factories produce weapons and ammunition miles from front lines. The mathematics were brutally simple. Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched to its limits fighting in China, throughout Southeast Asia, across Pacific Islands. Adding American invasion would require resources they didn't possess. Their industrial output alone makes this impossible, Yamamoto stated flatly. I visited their automobile factories. I toured their steel mills. I saw what they're capable of producing. At current rates, America builds more aircraft in 1 month than we build in 3. They launch new naval vessels weekly. Their tank production exceeds ours 5-1. And these figures will only increase as they mobilize fully. The general who suggested limited invasion now looked pale. But if we achieved surprise before they could mobilize. We already struck with surprise, Yamamoto cut him off. Pearl Harbor was our surprise. And their response? Not surrender. Not negotiation. Complete mobilization. Total commitment to victory. Every factory converted to war production. We didn't defeat them, we unified them. Yamamoto had saved his most crucial observation for this moment. The thing that made American invasion not just difficult or costly, but genuinely impossible. I studied their history during my time there, he began, his voice taking on different quality. I read their founding documents. I watched how they behave. And I came to understand something fundamental about American character that makes them unlike any enemy we've ever faced. The generals gave full attention. When we conquered Chinese territory, we broke their armies and they surrendered. When European colonial powers faced defeat, they negotiate and withdraw. Traditional warfare has rules, endpoints, surrender conditions. You defeat the army, capture the capital, force terms. He paused for emphasis. America doesn't work that way. Their entire national identity was forged by revolution. Farmers and shopkeepers who fought the British Empire and won. They celebrate this history. They teach it to their children. Their culture glorifies individual resistance to authority. One general objected. But they're a modern nation now. They have professional military government, command structures. Yes, Yamamoto agreed. And if we somehow defeated their military, what then? We haven't defeated America. We've only eliminated one obstacle. Behind that military stands 100 million armed citizens who don't recognize any authority to surrender on their behalf. He let this sink in. In Japan, if the emperor orders surrender, the people obey. There's hierarchy, structure, chain of command reaching every citizen. But Americans? Their states barely listen to their federal government. Their local communities often ignore state governments. Individual Americans frequently disregard laws they disagree with. There's no single switch we can flip to turn off American resistance. Capture Washington, and the states keep fighting. Defeat their armies, and millions of armed civilians continue resisting. There is no surrender ceremony that ends American resistance because there is no authority that truly controls all Americans. We would be fighting 100 million separate wars against 100 million separate enemies. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. The words Yamamoto spoke that day would echo through history. Whether uttered exactly in that moment or drawn from his writings, the sentiment captured a profound truth that events would validate completely. Japan never attempted mainland invasion. Not in 1942 when their power peaked. Not in 1943 as the tide turned. Not ever. When Japan occupied Kiska and Alaska's Aleutian Islands, even barren frozen rocks defended by Americans became untenable. The islands held minimal strategic value and tiny populations, yet American forces fought with such determination to reclaim them that Japan eventually withdrew, unable to justify the cost. Meanwhile, across America, the civilian population mobilized exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. Volunteer defense organizations formed in virtually every community. Aircraft spotters watched skies. Coastal watchers patrolled beaches. Citizens conducted blackout drills. The weapons they already owned remained in their homes, ready. More firearms were manufactured. Ammunition production soared. Shooting clubs expanded membership. Fathers trained sons and daughters not just for sport anymore, but for defense. America's industrial capacity transformed into a war machine of unprecedented scale. Automobile factories converted to tank and aircraft production with stunning efficiency. Steel mills produced armor plate and ship hulls. Workshops became arsenals. By 1943, American production exceeded the combined output of all Axis nations. By 1944, the disparity had grown even more dramatic. Yamamoto had been right about everything. The numbers, the terrain, the armed population, the industrial capacity, the cultural determination, all proved exactly as he foresaw. He died in April 1943, his aircraft ambushed by American fighters over Bougainville after intelligence broke Japanese codes. He never witnessed full validation of his warnings, never saw Japan's eventual surrender, never knew historians would remember his words about the sleeping giant as perhaps the most prescient military assessment in modern warfare. But his analysis had been absolutely correct. Behind every blade of grass would have been a rifle, behind every window a defender. Across every mile of American territory, an armed population willing to fight for their homes. America was unconquerable, not because of any single factor, but because of a unique combination of geography, culture, armament, and national character that created something unprecedented in military history. A nation that couldn't be invaded successfully because the invasion would never truly end. Because even defeating their military meant facing millions of armed citizens who recognized no authority to surrender on their behalf. The irony emerged years later when Japanese military planners developed Operation Ketsugo, their plan for defending home islands against American invasion. It called for total mobilization. Every citizen became a soldier. Every woman and child trained to fight. Every beach fortified. The Japanese high command had learned from Yamamoto's analysis. They understood now what armed civilian resistance looked like. They planned to inflict casualties so horrific that America would negotiate peace rather than pay the blood price. But there was a crucial difference. Japan had 30 million people on their home islands. America had over 100 million spread across a continent. Japan had limited firearms distributed to a suddenly mobilized population. America had 100 million guns already in civilian hands, with a population shooting since childhood. The scale wasn't comparable. What might cost America hundreds of thousands of casualties in Japan would have cost Japan millions in America. And unlike Japan's island nation, American territory was so vast that even successful coastal landings meant thousands of miles of hostile territory ahead. Atomic weapons ended the war before invasion plans could be tested, before the world could witness what happens when modern military attempts to conquer a homeland defended by its entire population. But the question haunts military historians. What if Japan had attempted to invade America? The answer, validated by every piece of evidence, confirms Yamamoto's assessment completely. It would have been impossible. Not difficult. Not costly. Actually impossible. The invasion force would have been ground down before advancing beyond coastal regions. Supply lines would have collapsed under submarine attacks and logistical impossibilities. Every mile of advance would have triggered increasing resistance from an armed population defending their homes. There would have been no dramatic final battle, no surrender ceremony, just endless attrition as Japanese forces bled out against an enemy that couldn't be defeated because it couldn't be truly engaged. How do you fight a war when your enemy is everywhere and nowhere? When every town is a potential battlefield? When every civilian might be armed? You don't. You can't. That was Yamamoto's revelation. That was the truth he tried to make his fellow officers understand. The metaphor Yamamoto used captured something profound about America's transformation during World War II. Before Pearl Harbor, America was isolationist, divided, uncertain about entering another global conflict. The attack unified them instantly. The sleeping giant opened its eyes filled with terrible resolve. That giant possessed industrial capacity beyond anything the world had ever seen. It possessed natural resources spanning an entire continent. It possessed technological innovation and organizational efficiency that would define modern warfare. And perhaps most importantly, it possessed an armed population that didn't need to be mobilized or trained because they were already armed and already trained. Yamamoto had seen this giant sleeping during his years in America. He had walked among its people. He had witnessed their capabilities firsthand. He had understood what they would become once awakened. And he had tried desperately to warn his fellow officers about attacking them. They hadn't listened. They had believed in Japanese superiority, in warrior spirit, in tactical excellence. They thought those attributes would overcome any disadvantage. They were wrong. The war proved every one of Yamamoto's warnings correct. America's industrial output crushed Japan's economy. America's military, once mobilized, overwhelmed Japanese forces across the Pacific. America's determination never wavered, and America's armed civilian population remained ready, waiting behind that final defensive line that would never be tested. The weapon that made America unconquerable wasn't secret technology, wasn't a wonder weapon, wasn't brilliant military strategy. It was millions of ordinary citizens in millions of ordinary homes, with millions of ordinary firearms spread across millions of square miles of territory, unified by a culture that valued independence and prepared to defend what was theirs. Against that reality, no invasion force stood a chance. Yamamoto knew it. History proved it. And the sleeping giant never needed to fully demonstrate it because the message was clear enough without the demonstration. Some weapons don't need to be fired to achieve their purpose. They just need to exist, visible and undeniable, a warning to anyone who might be tempted to test them. That was America in World War II. That was the truth Yamamoto tried to convey. That was the reality that made invasion impossible.